She was paid to pour the wine, not to read the death warrant. Maya, 24 years old, a master of forensic linguistics disguised as a silent server, had one rule at the Gilded Lily: stay in the shadows, keep the glass full, and never exist. But tonight, in a suite thick with a scent of expensive tobacco and cold ambition, Ji-hoon, the man who owns half of Seoul's skyline and all of its secrets, is about to sign a multi-billion-dollar treaty that will end a decade of shadow wars. The parchment is ancient. The Hanja characters are elegant. The world's leading legal expert, Julian Sterling, has sworn on his reputation that every stroke is perfect. The ink is right. The seal is right. The legacy is secured. Except it isn't. And Maya, leaning forward with a bottle of vintage Cristal and a terrifyingly sharp eye for calligraphic forgery, has exactly 5 seconds to do the unthinkable: point at one tiny flourish and prove that the expert is a traitor. One sentence will halt a hostile takeover, expose a global conspiracy, and reveal that the invisible waitress knows more about the boss's empire than the men paid to protect it. The Seoul rain was needle-sharp, turning the neon lights of Gangnam into a blurred kaleidoscope of violet and gold. At the apex of the city, where armored limousines idled in private bays and security details spoke in hushed radio codes, the Gilded Lily sat behind 3 layers of biometric steel. It wasn't just a lounge. It was a sanctuary where gods of industry and kings of the underworld rewrote the law over $5,000 glasses of cognac. If you were in this room, you were either making history or being erased by it. And moving through this temple of glass and steel, carrying a silver tray and wearing a uniform that functioned as high-end camouflage, was Maya. At 24, Maya had become a ghost in plain sight. Her hair was pinned into a bun so precise it looked sculpted. Her vest was stiff, her tie was straight, and her eyes were always down, until she saw the lie written in ink. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating pressure that seemed to dim the very lights of the penthouse. Julian Sterling broke it first, a sharp, jagged laugh tearing through the tension. He didn't look at Maya. He looked at Ji-hoon, spreading his hands in a gesture of weary disbelief. "My apologies, Ji-hoon. It seems the hospitality staff is sampling the vintage before serving it. Young lady, I suggest you take your hand off that document before the ink stains more than just your reputation." But Ji-hoon didn't move. His hand, heavy with the weight of a gold-encrusted watch, remained frozen over the contract. He wasn't looking at the expert. He was looking at the way Maya's finger didn't tremble. He was looking at the way her eyes, usually cast downward in practiced subservience, were now locked onto the parchment with the intensity of a sniper. "A lie." Ji-hoon's voice was a low vibration, dangerous and rhythmic. "Explain." "It's a Hanja variant used in 18th-century land seizures," Maya said, her voice cutting through Julian's sputtering indignation. She leaned closer, the scent of the expensive lilies on the table mixing with the metallic tang of the ink. "Look at the radical on the left. In a standard partnership clause, the stroke is horizontal, signifying balance. But here, the brush has been flicked upward, a poison hook. It transforms the meaning from joint ownership to unilateral forfeiture. If you sign this, you aren't merging your shipping lanes. You are legally declaring them abandoned property, free for the first vetted claimant to seize." Julian stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "This is preposterous. I have practiced international law for 30 years. I have navigated treaties that built nations while this girl was still learning her alphabet. Ji-hoon, are you truly going to listen to a waitress who likely can't even read her own rent agreement over the man who saved your father's estate?" Julian turned his fury on Maya, his shadow looming over her. "You've made a fatal mistake, girl. You think a few night school classes give you the right to interrupt a billion-dollar negotiation. Leave. Before I make sure you never find work in this city again." Maya felt the cold sweat slicking her palms, but she didn't flinch. She saw the trap Julian had set, not just in the ink, but in the room. He was relying on her invisibility. He was counting on the fact that in a room of lions, no one listens to the lamb. Slowly Ji-hoon stood up. He was a head shorter than Julian, but his presence made the expert seem like a crumbling monument. He picked up the document, holding it up to the light of the crystal chandelier. He looked at the tiny microscopic flick of ink Maya had identified. Then he looked at Julian. "The girl is 24, Ji-hoon said softly, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "And yet, she noticed the ink is still wet on the third page, while the first two are bone dry. Why is that, Julian?" Julian's eyes darted to the door, his composed facade finally showing a hairline fracture. It's a matter of the paper's acidity, Ji-hoon. Different batches. "It's because you swapped the page when I looked away to pour the wine," Ji-hoon interrupted. He turned to Maya, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone and shadow. "You have a gift for details, Maya. It's a shame to waste it on pouring wine." He took the gold pen, the one Julian had gifted him for the occasion, and snapped it in half. The black ink bled across the white tablecloth, a dark stain spreading like an omen. "Julian," Ji-hoon whispered, "the girl says the third stroke is a lie. I think the entire man is a lie. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Ji-hoon's security detail closes in on Julian while Maya is offered a choice that will change her life forever?" The double doors of the private suite at the Gilded Lily didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. Before the men even crossed the threshold, the air in the room underwent a violent shift, shedding its warmth for a sterile, pressurized chill. Maya stood by the sideboard, her fingers instinctively tightening around the silver neck of a wine decanter. She had served heads of state and tech titans, but this was different. This was the arrival of the apex. Julian Sterling entered first. He was the picture of Western prestige, a silver-haired titan in a bespoke charcoal suit that whispered of London tailors and generational wealth. He carried a leather attaché case like a holy relic, his expression one of bored, practiced authority. To the world, Julian was the ultimate safeguard, the expert whose signature on a document was more legally binding than a Supreme Court ruling. But as he scanned the room, Maya noticed the way his eyes lingered on the security cameras for a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't the look of a man checking for safety. It was the look of a man checking for witnesses. Then came Ji-hoon. He didn't walk so much as he occupied the space, moving with a predatory grace that made the expansive suite feel suddenly small. His black hair was slicked back with military precision, the sharp undercut emphasizing the lean, hard lines of a face that hadn't smiled in a decade. He wore his suit jacket open, a deliberate middle finger to the stifling formality of the room, revealing the dark ink of a tiger's coil peeking above his collar. The tattoos on his hands, thick, black traditional work, contrasted jarringly with the delicate gold pen he pulled from his breast pocket. "The girl," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in Maya's chest. He didn't look at her, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical blow. "Does she stay?" Julian offered a thin, oily smile, pulling out a heavy velvet-lined chair. "She's a fixture of the house, Ji-hoon. Part of the furniture. She's paid for her silence as much as her service. We need the wine poured. It's a long night of fine print ahead of us." Julian began to lay out the documents, the heavy parchment crinkling with a sound like dry bone. He moved with a flourish, his hands steady and confident as he arranged the multi-billion-dollar treaty under the glow of the crystal chandelier. Maya stepped forward, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rug. As she reached for the glass nearest to Ji-hoon, her gaze brushed against the first page of the contract. It was meant to be a cursory glance, the habit of a woman who had spent her university years buried in the forensic study of ancient Hanja. But a single character caught her eye, tucked away in a subclause about maritime jurisdiction. The ink was dark, the calligraphy exquisite, and the seal of the Korean consulate was perfectly embossed in red wax. To an expert like Julian, it was a masterpiece of diplomacy. But to Maya the stroke was wrong. It was a stylistic choice that hadn't been used since the Joseon dynasty, except in one very specific context: the signing of a death warrant for a traitor. She felt the blood drain from her face, the cold from the penthouse windows finally seeping into her bones. She began to pour the wine, the steady stream of dark liquid the only sound in the room, while the two most powerful men in the city prepared to sign a lie. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Maya must decide if she will risk her life to interrupt the signing before the pen touches the paper? The silver neck of the wine decanter felt freezing in Maya's hand, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the tension radiating from the center of the room. On the mahogany table, the documents were no longer just paper. They had become a landscape of power, a sprawling map of an empire ready to be traded. Julian Sterling reached into his leather attaché and withdrew a heavy, vellum-bound folder. With the reverence of a high priest, he laid it open, the pages thick and creamy under the amber glow of the chandelier. "The culmination of 18 months of negotiation, Ji-hoon," Julian murmured, his voice smooth and hypnotic. 3 shipping lanes, 4 major ports, and the absolute dissolution of the northern family's influence. "It's all here. Clean. Final." Ji-hoon leaned forward, his black suit jacket straining slightly against his shoulders. He didn't touch the paper yet. Instead, he watched Julian with the detached curiosity of a tiger observing a tethered goat. The tattoos on the back of the boss's hands, intricate dark swirls that vanished into his cuffs, seemed to pulse in the low light. He looked younger than his reputation suggested, his face a landscape of sharp angles and cold discipline, but his eyes held the weary weight of a man who had seen every betrayal the underworld had to offer. Julian reached for a small, ornate box. Inside sat a stick of deep crimson wax and a heavy brass signet. With a practiced flick of a gold lighter, he melted the wax, letting the thick, blood-red droplets fall onto the signature line of the primary deed. The scent of burning resin filled the air, cloying, sweet, and metallic. Then, with a firm, decisive thud, Julian pressed the signet into the cooling pool. The seal of the alliance was broken, and the new era was ready to be christened. $4 billion, Julian whispered, the number hanging in the air like a physical weight. The largest private maritime transfer in the history of the peninsula. All that's missing is the ink. Maya stepped closer to refill Ji-hoon's glass, her movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. As the dark liquid swirled into the crystal, her eyes were drawn, almost magnetically, to the fresh indentation of the wax seal. To any observer, it was a masterpiece of formal bureaucracy. But Maya didn't see the prestige. She saw the geometry. Her mind, trained to detect the subtlest deviations in historical calligraphy, caught a microscopic flaw in the crest's border. The seal wasn't just a symbol, it was a lock. And the key Julian was handing over didn't fit the history of the house it claimed to represent. Julian slid the gold pen across the table. It rolled with a hollow, rhythmic clicking sound that felt like a countdown. Ji-hoon's fingers closed around the barrel. He pulled the document toward him, the heavy vellum scraping against the wood. The room was so silent that Maya could hear the erratic rhythm of Julian's breathing, fast, shallow, and desperate. The boss adjusted his grip on the pen, the nib hovering just inches above the red wax. Maya felt a cold sweat break across her collarbone. She was the only person in the world who realized that the paper empire being built on this table was constructed on a foundation of sand and treachery. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Maya notices the poison pill hidden in the calligraphy and faces the terrifying choice to speak? The light from the crystal chandelier overhead fractured against the surface of the wine Maya was pouring, casting dancing, amber reflections across the vellum. Ji-hoon's hand, dark with the intricate ink of his heritage, moved with a slow, tectonic inevitability. He pulled the third page of the treaty toward the center of the table, his eyes tracking the lines of Hanja with a detached, lethal focus. Beside him, Julian Sterling sat like a statue carved from ice, his breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. Maya leaned in, the silver neck of the decanter tilted at a perfect 45-degree angle. Her role was to be a shadow, a silent witness to the redistribution of a kingdom. But as the dark liquid swirled into Ji-hoon's glass, her gaze caught on a single character in the middle of the 11th clause, the section defining the succession of assets. Her heart didn't just race, it stopped. To the untrained eye, the calligraphy was a masterpiece of traditional form. But Maya didn't see the beauty. She saw the architecture of a trap. In the character for partnership, the final stroke, a decisive downward sweep, had been altered. A microscopic flick of the brush, a ghost stroke, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years memorizing the forensic nuances of 18th-century land deeds, had transformed the symbol into liquidation. It was a linguistic poison pill. If Ji-hoon signed this page, he wasn't merging his empire with Julian's Western backers. He was legally declaring his own organization insolvent, triggering a clause that would allow a third party, likely a shell company controlled by Julian, to seize every port, every ship, and every bank account in a matter of seconds. It was a bloodless execution, written in the very ink Julian had sworn was sacred. Maya's hand trembled, a microscopic vibration that caused a single drop of wine to bead at the rim of the glass. She looked at Julian. The expert wasn't looking at the document anymore. He was watching the gold nib of Ji-hoon's pen, his eyes wide and hungry, reflecting the glint of the gold like a man watching a fuse burn toward a mountain of gunpowder. He knew. He had vetted this document not for accuracy, but for its lethality. Ji-hoon adjusted his grip, the nib of the pen descending toward the vellum. The scratch of the gold against the paper would be the sound of an empire falling. Maya looked at the boss, the man who owned the city, the man whose tattoos told stories of wars won and enemies buried. He was a lion being led into a cage by a man he called a friend. The silence in the suite became a physical weight, pressing against Maya's lungs. She was a waitress at the Gilded Lily. She was paid for her invisibility. In this room, she was less than a ghost. But as the pen touched the paper, the poison pill screamed at her from the page. One stroke, one lie, one choice. She looked at the red wax seal, still warm and smelling of metallic smoke. The stroke of death was right there, waiting for the boss's signature to give it life. Maya felt the cold sweat slicking her palms against the silver decanter. If she spoke, she broke the only rule that kept her safe. If she stayed silent, she watched a man sign his own death warrant. The nib pressed down, the first millimeter of the signature beginning to form. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Maya makes the dangerous decision to interrupt the signing before the ink dries? The air in the suite felt as though it had been sucked into a vacuum. Ji-hoon's fingers, calloused and mapped with the dark ink of 1,000 battles, tightened around the gold barrel of the pen. It was a weapon now, poised to strike the final blow against his own sovereignty. Beside him, Julian Sterling leaned in, his silver hair shimmering under the chandelier like a halo for a saint who had long ago sold his soul. Maya stood at the precipice of a 5-second window. In the first second she saw the expert's hand. Julian wasn't just observing. He was vibrating with a suppressed, manic energy. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the mahogany table, and his eyes weren't on the signature line. They were darting toward the heavy oak doors, calculating the exit strategy. In the second, she realized the depth of the betrayal. This wasn't a clerical error or a mistranslation by a distant scribe. The poison pill she had spotted, the subtle upward flick of the partnership character, was a masterpiece of forensic deception. Julian hadn't just vetted this document. He had authored the trap. He wasn't the shield protecting the Korean Mafia's interests. He was the Trojan horse parked in the center of the palace. In the third second, the gold nib touched the vellum. A microscopic dot of black ink bloomed on the creamy surface, the beginning of the K that would signify the end of the Kong dynasty. Maya's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a deafening drumbeat that seemed to shake her very vision. She was a waitress. She was a girl with a debt to pay and a life she wanted to keep. To speak was to shatter the glass ceiling of the underworld's hierarchy. To stay silent was to be an accomplice to a murder in ink. In the fourth second, Ji-hoon paused. He sensed the shift in the room, the sudden jagged spike in Julian's adrenaline. The boss's eyes flickered toward the expert, a shadow of suspicion crossing his lethal features. But Julian was fast. He offered a reassuring paternal nod, his voice a smooth silk thread. "The future is waiting, Ji-hoon. Sign and we toast to a new era." Maya saw the boss's muscles relax, his trust in the old guard overriding his primal instincts. The pen began to move again, tracing the curve of the first letter. In the 5th second, the world narrowed down to the tip of that gold nib and the lie hidden in the calligraphy. Maya felt the silver wine decanter go heavy in her hand, a cold weight that grounded her. She looked at the poison pill one last time. It wasn't just a character. It was a death warrant. If that pen finished its journey, the shipping lanes would fall, the streets would bleed, and Julian Sterling would walk out of this room a billionaire while Ji-hoon was dismantled by his own legal counsel. The expert was smiling. It was the smile of a man who had already won. Maya stepped forward. She didn't think about the security detail outside or the legendary temper of the man with the tiger tattoos. She only thought about the truth. Before the first letter of Ji-hoon's name could be completed, she extended her hand, her index finger cutting through the dim light like a blade. She pressed her fingertip directly onto the wet ink of the document, smearing the beginning of the signature into a dark, illegible blur. "Wait," she whispered, her voice a sharp, crystalline strike against the silence. The room turned to ice. "Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Julian explodes in a calculated rage and Maya must defend her discovery before Ji-hoon's guards intervene?" The sound of Maya's finger pressing against the vellum was a dull, wet thud that felt louder than a thunderclap. The black ink of Ji-hoon's unfinished signature smeared under her skin, a dark smudge of defiance across a $4 billion deal. For a heartbeat, the room was suspended in a vacuum of disbelief. Ji-hoon didn't move. His hand remained wrapped around the gold pen, the nib still hovering a fraction of an inch from Maya's fingertip. He slowly turned his head, his dark, predatory eyes traveling up her arm, settling on her face with a gaze that could have stripped the paint from the walls. It was Julian who broke the silence, his voice cracking like a whip. "Are you insane?" he shrieked, the cultured London-tailored mask of the expert finally shattering. He lunged forward, his chair screeching violently against the mahogany floor. "You clumsy, ignorant girl. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've ruined a historical document. You've defaced a treaty that took 18 months to draft." Julian turned to Ji-hoon, his face a mottled, frantic red, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the smeared ink. "Ji-hoon, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. This creature has no business being in a room of this caliber. She's probably high or looking for a payout. Security, get this trash out of here before she does any more damage." Maya felt the cold prickle of fear at the base of her spine. She could hear the heavy tread of Ji-hoon's guards moving toward the door, their radio headsets crackling in the hallway. But she didn't pull her hand away. She kept her finger firmly planted on the poison pill, the ink staining the groove of her fingerprint. "He wants me gone because he doesn't want you to look at the character I'm covering," Maya said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a sharp, crystalline contrast to Julian's shrill desperation. Julian's eyes went wide, a flash of pure, animal panic flickering behind his pupils. "She's babbling. She's a waitress, Ji-hoon. She pours wine for a living. Are you really going to let a girl who carries trays insult the intelligence of the man who saved your shipping lanes in 22? He leaned over the table, his shadow looming over Maya, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and rot. "Get your filthy hand off that paper, or I will personally ensure you never breathe another breath in this city." "Julian," Ji-hoon said. It was a single word, spoken so quietly it barely carried across the table, but it silenced the room instantly. The boss hadn't looked at Julian once. He was still staring at Maya. He noticed the way she didn't flinch under Julian's shadow. He noticed the way her gaze remained fixed on the page, not out of fear, but out of a terrifying, scholarly certainty. Ji-hoon reached out, his tattooed hand closing around Maya's wrist. His grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. Slowly, he lifted her hand from the vellum. Maya's finger left a dark, blurred trail, but beneath the smudge, the ghost stroke she had identified was still visible, the upward flick that changed partnership to liquidation. "Explain the mark," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration. "It's a linguistic trap," Maya replied, her eyes meeting the boss's. "Mr. Sterling didn't draft a treaty. He drafted a seizure. If you sign this, you aren't a partner. You're a ghost." Julian let out a strangled, desperate sound, his hand reaching into his coat, not for a pen but for a way out. The expert had been exposed, and the room was no longer a suite. It was a cage. "Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Maya reveals the full extent of the linguistic trap and Julian's betrayal is laid bare?" The sound of Maya's fingertip pressing against the vellum was a dull, wet thud that felt louder than a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the suite. The black ink of Ji-hoon's unfinished signature smeared under her skin, a dark, defiant smudge across a $4 billion deal. For a heartbeat, the room was suspended in a vacuum of sheer disbelief. Ji-hoon didn't move. His hand remained wrapped around the gold pen, the nib still hovering a fraction of an inch from Maya's knuckle. He slowly turned his head, his dark, predatory eyes traveling up her arm and settling on her face with a gaze that could have stripped the lacquer from the mahogany table. It was Julian who broke the silence, his voice cracking like a whip. "Are you insane?" he shrieked, the cultured London-tailored mask of the expert finally shattering into jagged shards. He lunged forward, his chair screeching violently against the floor. "You clumsy, ignorant girl. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've ruined a historical document. You've defaced a treaty that took 18 months of diplomatic surgery to draft." Julian turned to Ji-hoon, his face a mottled, frantic red, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the smeared ink. "Ji-hoon, I am deeply, profoundly sorry. This creature has no business being in a room of this caliber. She's probably high or looking for a viral moment. Security, get this trash out of here before she does any more damage to your interests." Maya felt the cold prickle of fear at the base of her spine. She could hear the heavy tread of Ji-hoon's guards moving toward the door, their radio headsets crackling like static electricity in the hallway. But she didn't pull her hand away. She kept her finger firmly planted on the poison pill, the ink staining the delicate grooves of her fingerprint. "He wants me gone because he doesn't want you to look at the character I'm covering," Maya said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a sharp, crystalline contrast to Julian's shrill, panicked desperation. Julian's eyes went wide, a flash of pure, animal panic flickering behind his pupils. "She's babbling. She's a waitress, Ji-hoon. She pours wine for a living. Are you really going to let a girl who carries trays and clears breadcrumbs insult the intelligence of the man who saved your shipping lanes in 22? He leaned over the table, his shadow looming over Maya, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and the rot of a hidden agenda. "Get your filthy hand off that paper, or I will personally ensure you never breathe another breath in this city." "Julian," Ji-hoon said. It was a single word, spoken so quietly it barely carried across the table, but it silenced the room instantly. The boss hadn't looked at Julian once. He was still staring at Maya. He noticed the way she didn't flinch under Julian's shadow. He noticed the way her gaze remained fixed on the page, not out of fear, but out of a terrifying, scholarly certainty. Ji-hoon reached out, his tattooed hand closing around Maya's wrist. His grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute, a band of iron. Slowly, he lifted her hand from the vellum. Maya's finger left a dark, blurred trail, but beneath the smudge, the ghost stroke she had identified was still visible, the upward flick that changed partnership to liquidation. "Explain the mark," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration. "It's a linguistic trap," Maya replied, her eyes meeting the boss's. Mr. Sterling didn't draft a treaty. He drafted a seizure. If you sign this, you aren't a partner. You're a ghost. Julian let out a strangled, desperate sound, his hand reaching into his coat, not for a pen but for a way out. The expert had been exposed, and the room was no longer a suite. It was a cage. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Maya reveals the full extent of the linguistic trap and Julian's betrayal is laid bare? The silence in the room was no longer cold. It was electrified, humming with the static of a looming explosion. Ji-hoon's grip on Maya's wrist remained firm, but his touch had changed from a threat to a tether. He was holding her in place not to silence her, but to ensure she didn't vanish before the truth was fully excavated. Julian's laughter was thin and brittle, the sound of glass breaking under a boot. A linguistic trap. Ji-hoon listened to the absurdity. She's a waitress, not a philologist. She saw a smudge and invented a conspiracy. This is a standard Hanja typeface used in every maritime contract from Busan to Singapore. It isn't a typeface, Maya said, her voice cutting through Julian's frantic deflection like a scalpel. She didn't look at the expert. She kept her eyes on the document, her mind projecting the centuries of calligraphy she had studied in secret. It's a deliberate archaism. Look at the radical for gong, the symbol for public or shared. In a modern partnership, the base stroke is a flat, horizontal line. It represents a level foundation, a balance of power. She leaned closer, her breath hitching as she pointed to the microscopic flourish Julian had hoped would be dismissed as a stylistic choice. But here, the brush has been flicked upward at a 30-degree angle. In the forensic linguistics of the Joseon era, that's a poison hook. It's used in empty promise contracts. By adding that single flick, the legal definition of the word changes from shared assets to relinquished assets. Julian's face turned a shade of gray that matched his expensive suit. That's an academic interpretation. It holds no weight in a modern court. It does when the governing law of this contract is cited in the preamble as traditional customary code, Maya countered, her confidence blooming in the heat of the confrontation. You chose that specific legal framework because it allows these archaic linguistic traps to supersede modern definitions. If Mr. Kong signs this, he isn't entering a billion-dollar merger. He is legally declaring his entire organization a vacant house. Under this specific code, a vacant house is forfeit to the witness of the deed. And who is the sole witness listed on page 42? Julian. Ji-hoon's eyes didn't leave the page, but the muscles in his jaw tightened until they looked like cords of steel. The expert had banked on the boss's respect for tradition being his blind spot. He had banked on the invisible server being illiterate in the language of power. The flick of ink isn't a mistake, Mr. Kong, Maya whispered, the weight of the revelation settling over the table. It's a silent execution. He wasn't vetting your future. He was drafting your obituary. The gold pen in Ji-hoon's other hand snapped. The sound was as sharp as a bone breaking. Black ink sprayed across the white linen, mirroring the dark stain Julian had tried to hide. Ji-hoon slowly stood up, the tiger tattoo on his neck seeming to ripple as he turned his full, terrifying attention toward Julian. The girl sees a hook, Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a register that made the crystal glasses on the sideboard chime. And I see a man who thinks I am blind. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. The expert was staring at the small, smeared character on the vellum, the tiny detail that had just cost him everything. The snap of the gold pen echoed through the suite like a sentence being passed. For Julian Sterling, the sound was the tolling of a funeral bell. The charcoal gray suit that had once lent him an air of untouchable authority now seemed to sag on his frame, making him look smaller, older, and desperately frail against the looming shadow of the man he had tried to swindle. Julian's eyes darted from the smeared poison hook on the vellum to the stone-cold mask of Ji-hoon's face. The practiced baritone of his voice was gone, replaced by a high, reedy thinness that betrayed the terror clawing at his throat. Ji-hoon, listen. She's twisted the meaning. It's an academic nuance. We can redraft. We can strike the clause. It was a clerical error by my associates in London. I'll have their heads for this, I swear. You already have your own head to worry about, Julian, Ji-hoon said. His voice a low, terrifying rumble. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The quietness of his tone was far more lethal than any roar. Julian backed away from the table, his heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. His hands, usually so steady when navigating the billion-dollar complexities of maritime law, were now trembling so violently that he had to clench them into fists. This is a misunderstanding. I've served your family for years. Would I throw away decades of trust for a single contract? For $4 billion. Yes, Maya said softly. She remained standing by the table, the ink of the lie still staining her fingertip. And for the silent liquidation of a rival's bloodline. You didn't just want the money, Mr. Sterling. You wanted the throne. Julian's mask finally fell away, revealing the jagged edges of a cornered predator. He didn't look at Ji-hoon. He turned his venomous gaze on Maya. You meddling little brat. You should have stayed invisible. You should have just poured the wine. He lunged toward the table, his hand clawing for the attaché case, not to save the contract, but to reach the burner phone hidden in the silk lining. He never made it. The heavy oak doors of the suite didn't open. They were filled. 2 men in charcoal suits, their faces as expressionless as the stone of a tomb, stepped into the room. They didn't need a command. They moved with the synchronized precision of a single machine. Before Julian could even touch the leather of his bag, a hand like a vice closed around his shoulder, and another gripped his throat, pinning him against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. The city lights of Seoul glittered behind Julian's terrified reflection. Outside, the rain continued to fall, indifferent to the collapse of a titan. The girl was right, Julian, Ji-hoon said, walking slowly toward the window. He stopped just inches from the expert, his shadow swallowing the older man whole. The third stroke was a lie. And every word you've spoken since you walked through that door has been a ghost. Ji-hoon turned back to the table, looking at the silver wine decanter and then at Maya. He didn't look at the guards as they dragged a sobbing, pleading Julian toward the private elevator. The sound of the expert's heels dragging across the mahogany was the final punctuation mark on a 30-year career built on deception. Maya, Ji-hoon said, her name sounding heavy and strange on his tongue. He looked at the smeared ink on the vellum, then back at her. Clean the table, then sit down. We have a real contract to write. Chapter 9. The suite had fallen into a silence, so profound it felt as though the very walls were holding their breath. The distant rhythmic hum of the city far below was the only reminder that time hadn't stopped entirely. Julian Sterling was gone. His legacy dissolved into the humid air of the hallway, leaving behind nothing but a scent of expensive cologne and the bitter tang of betrayal. Ji-hoon stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of Seoul's neon-drenched rain. He didn't look at the doors. He didn't look at the broken gold pen leaking its black lifeblood onto the white linen. He looked at the document. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and swept the $4 billion treaty off the table. It didn't flutter. It fell with a heavy, dead thud against the mahogany floor, a discarded pile of useless vellum and lies. Maya stood perfectly still. Her hands were clasped in front of her server's vest, her fingers still stained with the ink of the poison hook. She waited for the reprimand, for the dismissal, for the security detail. To return and escort the girl who knew too much out of the building. In the world of the Gilded Lily, invisible was a survival strategy. By speaking, she had committed the ultimate sin of her profession. She had become a person. Ji-hoon turned. The light from the chandelier caught the tiger tattoo on his neck, making the ink appear to breathe. He walked back to the table, but he didn't return to the head of it. Instead, he pulled out the heavy velvet-lined chair Julian had occupied just moments ago. He gestured toward it with a hand that had spent the evening prepared to sign away an empire. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't a request, but the edge of lethal coldness had been replaced by something else, a jagged, dangerous kind of respect. Maya hesitated for only a second before she lowered herself into the chair. The velvet was warm, still holding the heat of the man who had tried to bury the boss in legal prose. Across the table, Ji-hoon sat down, leaning forward until the light revealed the sharp, calculating intelligence in his eyes. He didn't look at her as a server anymore. He looked at her as a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You saw a stroke of ink that a man with 40 years of experience swore was perfect," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp. "You saw a poison pill, hidden in a language that is dying out even in the universities." "Why?" "I don't just see the words, Mr. Kong," Maya replied, her voice steadying as she realized the shadow of the lion wasn't meant to crush her. "Not yet. I see the intent behind the hand. Calligraphy is an autobiography." Julian Sterling was writing a theft, and he was too arrogant to realize that the help might be able to read his handwriting. A shadow of a smile, cold and brief as a winter sun, flickered across Ji-hoon's face. He reached for a fresh glass, not the one she had poured, but a clean one from the sideboard. He poured the wine himself, the dark liquid swirling in the crystal like a captured storm. He pushed the glass toward her. "I have spent my life paying experts to tell me what I want to hear," Ji-hoon said, his gaze fixed on her stained fingertip. "It seems I've been paying for the wrong kind of silence. The Gilded Lily calls you staff. My files likely call you service. But I think it's time I heard it from the source." He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been demolished and rebuilt around the girl in the black vest. "Tell me," Ji-hoon whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute focus. "What is your name? Properly this time." Maya met his gaze, the invisible waitress finally stepping out of the shadows for good. "My name is Maya." Ji-hoon nodded slowly, the gold of the chandelier reflecting in his dark pupils. "Maya, drink your wine. Tomorrow we begin redrafting. And this time you'll be the one holding the pen." The transition from service to consultant was not a slow climb. It was a sudden, dizzying ascent. Within 48 hours, Maya had swapped her black server's vest for a tailored silk blouse, though the weight of the room still felt the same, heavy with the scent of old wood and new blood. She sat at the mahogany table, not with a tray, but with a stack of internal ledgers that Ji-hoon's experts had certified as clean for the last 5 years. Ji-hoon sat across from her, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, coiled strength of the tiger tattoos on his forearms. He watched her with a silence that was neither warm nor cold, but purely expectant. He had discarded Julian Sterling like a broken tool, and now he was testing the temper of the new blade he had found in his kitchen. Maya's eyes moved over the ledgers, her mind slipping into the rhythmic trance of pattern recognition. She wasn't looking at the numbers. She was looking at the syntax of the entries. Forensic linguistics taught that every person has a verbal fingerprint, a unique way of structuring data that no amount of professional training can entirely erase. "The shipping manifests from the Busan terminal," Maya said, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. "They weren't written by the terminal manager, Mr. Kong." Ji-hoon's eyes narrowed, a single muscle jumping in his jaw. "Manager Choi has been with my family since I was a boy. He is a ghost in the system. He doesn't make mistakes." "He didn't make a mistake," Maya replied, sliding a ledger toward him. She pointed to a series of inventory codes. "Look at the spacing between the Hanja characters and the numerals. There's a consistent microscopic hesitation, a double tap of the digital pen, before every high-value shipment of semiconductors." She pulled a second document from the stack, the private security logs from Ji-hoon's own personal estate. "Now look at these. The logs for your inner circle's biometric entries. The spacing is identical. The pressure sensitivity is a perfect match. Ji-hoon leaned in, the shadows of the room deepening the lines of his face. "What are you telling me, Maya?" "Julian Sterling was a distraction," she whispered, the gravity of the realization making the air feel thin. "He was the loud, expensive frontman. But the person actually bleeding you dry isn't a Western lawyer. It's someone who has been sitting in this room for years. Someone who knows your biometric codes and the rhythm of your shipments." She turned the page to a redacted list of payroll distributions. "The poison hook I found in the treaty. That wasn't Julian's style. It was too elegant, too traditionally Korean. Julian was just the one holding the pen. The person who actually drafted that trap is someone who knows your history as well as you do." The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was the silence of a man realizing his house was on fire from the inside out. Ji-hoon stood up slowly, walking to the door. He didn't call for his guards. He locked it himself. He turned back to Maya, his expression a mask of lethal clarity. "If you are wrong, you have insulted the only people I have left to trust. If you are right, I am standing in a den of vipers." "Check the timestamp on the last semiconductor shipment," Maya said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It was authorized 3 minutes after you entered your private gym yesterday. Only one person was outside that door, Mr. Kong. Only one person has the linguistic fingerprint of a man who hides his tracks with a double tap." Ji-hoon's gaze moved to the empty chair where his chief of security usually sat. The realization didn't break him. It sharpened him. He looked at Maya no longer as a lucky waitress, but as a weapon he couldn't afford to lose. "The second stroke wasn't a lie," Ji-hoon murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "The whole foundation is rot."